again, thank you to CG for hosting this event and how to say, continuing to build the momentum of INET and new economic thinking. This afternoon I have with me two extraordinary thinkers. The chief economist from the Nomura Research Institute, Richard Koo, who's no stranger to INET, having appeared in the first session of our first conference, where he and Ken Rogoff discussed the unfolding crisis. And to his left, Bruce Greenwald, a professor of economics and finance at Columbia Business School, who is, how do I say, from my experience, going back to being a graduate student at Princeton in the early 80s,
oh my God.
he is the secret Joe Stiglitz, having been a co-author of some of the most powerful and profound papers that Joe has written in his career. And I consider Bruce a co-author of a Nobel Prize. And Joe agrees with me, by the way. He says that very clearly. So, at any rate, we're here to talk today about the Great Recession. And going back to the Reinhardt and Rogoff presentation, they describe that in the presence of large amounts of debt, that the ensuing adjustment, the recession, is quite deep and quite prolonged. But in that work, they do not provide a perspective or a theory of why this is a long and deep recession. And in the conversation today, Richard Koo, with his well-known vision of a balance sheet recession, and Bruce, along with a team, has written very significant, I've read two of the papers about the relationship of real shocks to productivity and how the real structural problems really are at the core of, how would I say, what becomes a long and durable recession and has financial manifestations, but he sees the root cause emanating from a different place. So what I thought we'd do is we'd start with Richard and then Bruce, each talking for 10 to 12 minutes about their vision, their synopsis, and then we'll open the conversation between us, and then we'll move to conversation with the audience following that. So Richard, why don't you take away?
Okay. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about This Time is Different. Since we're going to start with Rogoff's book with the title This Time is Different, I believe that this time is different. And when we look around the indicators, we have zero interest rates in the United States for 4 years now. And we don't have full employment, we don't have inflation, we don't have much increase in money supply growth, we don't have much increase in credit growth either. And it's not just in the United States, it's all around the Western world, together with Japan. And you look at the budget deficit to GDP, it's 7 to 10% in all these countries. But where are the government bond yields? In Japan, less than 1%, in the US, 1 to 2, even in the UK, 1 to 2% range. And all these astronomical quantitative easings still haven't produced any of the effect that a lot of people expected. And those, in my view, suggest that this time is different. And what is different this time compared to other times, then we have to look into all sorts of indicators. There's so much confusion out there as to why this is so different from what we had earlier. Some people say there should be more fiscal stimulus, others say less, more monetary, others will say less, more structural reform, others will say no time to do structural reform when there's so much unemployment. Then people will argue that banking problem is the question, but some people will say if you go too fast on the disposal of non-performing loans, situation could actually get worse. So all these debates are going on in this part of the world. Very little consensus on what is the right thing to do. But it just so happened that Japan went through all of this 15 years ago. And I happened to be associated with the whole event because in 1997, Japan was told by the IMF, OECD, all these people who know nothing about anything, told Japan that you're building bridges to nowhere, roads to nowhere, economy going nowhere, and then you have aging population, why don't you cut the deficit? I was the only person in Japan who said, no, if you cut now, the whole thing will come crashing down. Well, it came crashing down. 5 quarters of negative growth, complete breakdown in the banking system, and it took Japan 10 years to climb out of that one policy mistake. And what I learned from that experience is that this is different in the sense that private sectors in all these economies, Japan first 15 years ago, and then now in the US, UK, Spain, Ireland, Portugal, all these economies, private sector is no longer maximizing profits. They're actually minimizing debt. And all the neoclassical economics we learn in schools are based on private sector maximizing profits. And of course, there's elaborate theories built on it. But when that fundamental assumption is violated, then we really have to start from scratch. And why are the private sectors sorts minimizing debt? Well, during the bubble days, they borrowed all this money and invested in all sorts of assets. And asset prices collapsed, liabilities remain, and suddenly they realized that their balance sheet's underwater. The balance sheet's underwater means you're bankrupt. You have to climb out of this thing. And even though people pay a lot of attention to those people who did go bankrupt, there are 10 times, 100 times more people who are trying to avoid that fate by trying to pay down their debt as quickly as possible so that you come out of this thing without not too many people noticing. But it's this debt repayment, repairing balance sheets by the people who do have cash flow. Whether you have still employed, you have an income to pay your mortgages, or you still have cash flow, you're running a company. It's these people paying down debt that causes what I call balance sheet recession. So what is balance sheet recession? I define it as private sector minimizing debt at near zero interest rates. Because if people are paying down debt at high interest rates, you can always think that you can bring rates down and then they will change their behavior. But if people are still paying down debt at near zero interest rates, then you're stuck because you cannot bring interest rates any lower. But if you are bankrupt, you really you don't have much choice. You have to pay down debt quietly as possible before everybody notices. And then once your balance sheets are repaired, of course you come out and says, of course my balance sheet is very clean. But in the meantime, you keep your heads low, make sure not too many people pay attention to you, and you quietly pay down debt. And when a large part of the society is doing that all at the same time, in the national economy, someone is saving money or paying down debt, you better have someone on the other side borrowing and spending money. And in the usual world, we have the financial sector in between taking the money from the savers and giving to the lenders, giving to the people who can use it. And with too many borrowers, interest rates are raised. Too few borrowers, interest rates are lowered. Make sure that this circle is completed. But when the traditional borrowers, the potential borrowers, they have balance sheet problems, they don't borrow money even at zero interest rates, then the whole thing breaks down. All the saved funds, deleveraged funds come into the financial sector. It cannot go out because there are no borrowers. And that becomes the leakage to the income stream, and the economy starts shrinking. And in this world, we are really lost because we were never trained to think about what to do when the private sector is minimizing debt. And Japan struggled that from around 1995 onwards, where demand for funds from corporate sector goes into the negative range, even at zero interest rates. And a lot of things are tried, monetary stimulus, quantitative easing, all of that. I would argue that at the end, and if you think it through logically, the only thing that works under circumstance like this is government to borrow the excess savings, so-called unborrowed savings in the private sector, and spend it. I'm no fan of fiscal stimulus per se. I mean, I entered Federal Reserve Bank of New York believing monetary policy. But after looking at what went through in Japan for all these years, I must say that when private sector as a group is paying down debt at near zero interest rates, then the only policy that can get the economy moving to make sure that this income stream is maintained is for the government to be borrowing and spending money. And Japan, except for this mistake in 1997, another smaller mistake in 2001, basically followed that rule without knowing what they were doing. We just happened to be blessed with these guys called liberal Democrats who are highly liberal with public spending. So every time economy was weak, they say, oh, let's build roads, bridges, thinking that it will get the pump priming going. But pump priming never happens in, I'm afraid, balance sheet recessions, because until private sector balance sheets are repaired, they're not going to start borrowing and investing based on on all the fiscal stimulus from the government. So pump priming never worked all the way into the 2000s, but at least the Japanese GDP was maintained. Japan's unemployment rate never went higher than 5.5%, even though Japanese commercial real estate prices fell 87% nationwide. Now try to think about that, right? United States, Canada, Toronto, Vancouver, New York, San Francisco, Orlando, everything down 87%. What kind of economy you got left here? But Japan managed to keep the GDP from falling, unemployment from rising with proper fiscal stimulus from the very beginning. Now, Japanese corporate balance sheets are all repaired. In fact, Japan has the cleanest balance, Japanese private sector has the cleanest balance sheets in the world, in that half of the Japanese companies, half of the listed Japanese companies today have no debt at all. I mean, they have some debt, but their financial assets are bigger than their financial liabilities at zero interest rates. Now, you can look at the situation and say, wow, that's a great balance sheet. But the bigger question one should ask is, what kind of private sectors do we have? Private sectors paying down debt at zero interest rates? That's not the kind of private sector we like to see, right? We like private sector to be maximizing profits, enlarging their business activities at these low interest rates. But today, even with the cleanest balance sheets in the world, Japanese private sector is saving something close to 10% of GDP. Then you look around the world, US private sector today is saving 8.5% of GDP at zero interest rates. And Ireland, 10% of GDP, Spain over 7% of GDP, even Portugal over 5% of GDP at zero interest rates or near zero interest rates. So we have a problem in the private sector that's global. And the reason government bond yields haven't gone up in spite of these large deficits is that all those savings that are being generated in these countries have no place to go except the government bond market. Now, I have to separate here between the Eurozone crisis and the rest. If you're a fund manager in the US, UK, or Japan, or Canada for that matter, and if you're under certain limitations, especially if you're working for pension or insurance, you cannot put too much money on your, you cannot take too much foreign exchange risk, you cannot take too much principal risk, and the private sector as a group is no longer borrowing money. Where can you put your money? The only place you can put your money is in your government bonds. That's why government bond yield come down to these ridiculously low levels in all of these economies. First happened in Japan. A lot of American hedge funds who had nothing better to do try to short the Japanese government bonds market, thinking that they're going to make tons of money. All of them lost money because this is what you expect in a balance sheet recession. And now you're seeing that in US, seeing that in UK. That's the market's way of telling the government that this is no time to cut the deficit. This is a time to increase the spending, get the economy moving, and only after the private sector is finished with its balance sheet problems, then you repair the government balance sheet. It has to be in that order. Now, why is this not happening in the Eurozone? Well, I go back to the same fund manager example. If you're a fund manager in Spain or in Ireland or in Portugal, and you cannot take too much foreign exchange risk, you cannot take too much currency risk, and your private sector is not borrowing money, do you have to buy Spanish government bonds? The answer is no. You can always buy German government bond. And that's basically what's happening in the Eurozone. So much of the funds the savings generated in these economies, over 7% of GDP in Spain, over nearly 10% of GDP in Ireland, they are all going to German government bond market. And as a result, bond yields go up, government panics. So, oh my God, the bond yield is going up, the bond vigilantes are on us, we have to cut. They try to cut the budget deficit when the private sector is also minimizing debt. The economy enters a deflationary spiral, just like what happened during the Great Depression in the United States from 1929 onwards. And when the economy enters a great deflationary spiral, fund managers get even more scared. So, oh my gosh, this government cannot possibly pay us back. So they move the money even further, and the economy just gets worse and worse and worse. So I would suggest that for the Eurozone problems that are affecting global economic scene at the moment, I would like to see European governments address two issues. One is that Maastricht Treaty is not designed to fight balance sheet recession. Maastricht Treaty says government has to reduce its deficit to 3% of GDP, but they have never anticipated a situation where the private sector may be saving 10% of GDP at zero interest rates. And it doesn't say anything about what to do in that kind of circumstances, what to do with the remaining 7% of GDP of unborrowed savings. If you don't do anything to this situation, Irish GDP will be shrinking 7% per year. So that's something that they have to work on. And the other part is what to do with this crazy flow of money between government bond markets within Europe. This doesn't happen anywhere else. It only happens in Europe. And one of my suggestions is that perhaps each of these jurisdictions will attach smaller risk weights for banks, insurance companies, and pension funds holding government bond of your own country, and higher risk weights for government bonds of other countries, trying to give some incentive for these countries to hold their own government bonds. And if as a result, if enough funds stayed in Spain, for example, then Spanish government bond yield will come down and nobody will be talking about Eurozone crisis anymore. And so I think we can come up with some of these mechanisms to address the problem in the Eurozone. For the other countries, I don't think they should be cutting budget deficit now. And of course, they are not under Maastricht Treaty, so US, UK, and Japan for the matter, should still be able to put in fiscal stimulus until private sector balance sheets are repaired, until trauma toward debt is overcome. The Japanese problem now, I mean, Japan has finished its cleanup of the private sector balance sheets, but there's one thing left, and that is that after private sector go through something like this for 10, 15 years, they become so sick of borrowing money, you won't believe. They will say, I never want to see those bankers again. And that kind of trauma is the one that's keeping Japan from really taking off. Even with the cleanest balance sheets, zero interest rates, bankers very willing to lend, Japanese companies say, no, we don't want to borrow. That was too much already. And to get over this trauma, we need separate set of incentives, like the one the President Obama put in here, I mean, not in Canada, in the United States, 2011. If you invest in 2011, you can write off everything during 2011. Japan could use that policy to get people off the trauma. Because once you're off the trauma, I mean, you jump over the trauma once, it's not a trauma anymore. And then I think Japanese economy will return to a normal textbook world that we learn in universities. But until that point, I think this trauma issue, what I call the exit problem of balance sheet recession, is something we have to overcome. And I'm afraid that if we continue like this in Europe and United States, Europe and United States will also start facing this problem of trauma toward debt, which would need a separate set of remedies to overcome. Thank you.
Bruce?
All right, actually, before if I'm allowed to, I'd just like to respond briefly to this notion of a balance sheet recession. And I think it's interesting, in fact, when you look at the history, that actually the decline in interest rates, while it's long-standing in Japan, is surprisingly recent in the rest of the world. When you started to talk about a balance sheet recession, it was precisely as over-levered companies who had profit streams that put their ability to service the debt at risk, and therefore they had to restructure their balance sheets. Now, it turns out that every recession looks like that. That companies expand, they put in capacity, there's a negative real shock, they're surprised at how low the sales are and profits are, they accumulate inventory and capacity because there's a lag, and then they cut back very sharply, much more sharply than they normally would, to restore their balance sheets. Now, that history has been widely known since the 1960s empirically, which is the work of Victor Zarnowitz and other people at the National Bureau of Economic Research, but also theoretically, the models that Joe and I and other people did are essentially balance sheet models, and they come out in the late 1970s, early 1980s. What seems to be different about the story that Richard's telling is a story of different degree. And that I would be willing to accept, that the shock has been larger, it looks like. That certainly in Japan, it took a very long time to work off the excess debt on these and the excess leverage in these corporations. But this still looks to me like Monty Python's story of the dead parrot. Guy goes into a store and the parrot is lying there on the counter not moving, like these companies not investing. And the guy says, oh, that parrot is, he's just resting. And the guy says, okay, because he's resting because he's got the excess debt. So ultimately, the John Cleese character who claims the parrot is dead picks up the parrot, beats him on the counter, and he's still not moving. And the head of the pet store says, oh, now you've put him into shock. It's not that he's sleeping anymore. And the story that's now being told about these balance sheet recessions is precisely that. Because the balance sheets got cured and the recessions did not. And the story Richard is telling is that these parrots were so put into shock, and it's not, by the way, that they have zero debt. You look at most big Japanese companies that are doing all this savings, they have huge negative debt. They have huge capital accumulation. And it seems to me that maybe this parrot is dead. And that the problem is not that the debt was too high or that was put into shock, but there is an underlying real condition here that is driving everything. And I want to start actually very differently than I planned to talk about this, by talking about this problem in Japan. Because Japan, remember, in this process, went from being the leading manufacturing country in the world to being, and I think it's fair to say, an also-ran among world economies. Now, suppose I had come to you in Japan in 1990 and said, I have a terrific opportunity for you to dominate the world economy. And as a Japanese policymaker, not that they'd be likely to listen to me, but you eagerly say to me, oh, what is that opportunity? And I say agriculture. You would know I was out of my mind. That in agriculture, productivity growth is extremely high. There's a limit to demand growth. And trying to grow in a dying industry is what it means to be a dead parrot who doesn't invest. That is happening to manufacturing all over the world for exactly the same reasons. Productivity growth in manufacturing is 5 to 7%, and global demand growth in manufacturing is maybe at best 2 to 3%. What that means is that manufacturing companies who are trying to grow and trying to invest have a very difficult road to hoe. And it's in fact even worse than that. And I'll give you some data from the United States that illustrates that. If you look at US investment in equipment and software, in real terms, it is about 50% higher relative to GDP than it was at the peak of the internet boom in 1999, 1998. If you look at nominal US investment as a fraction of GDP, it's substantially below where it was at every other recent recovery. Those firms can make those investments at a fraction of the cost that they used to be able to make them at, precisely because the machinery that they're buying are manufactured goods, and the economics of making robots have improved with the economics of all manufacturing. So that's the first thing I think you have to keep in mind. I think you also see that when you look at the pattern of the incidence of this crisis, both the depth of the drop and the persistence across countries. It is not, by the way, the countries with the biggest financial bubbles that are in trouble. That's the US and the UK. The US actually is among the least affected in terms of the drop in GDP, and it's substantially above where it was in 2007 in GDP. Japan, by the way, where the companies were in really good shape at the beginning of the crisis, suffered a 7% drop peak to trough in GDP, and is still significantly below where it was in 2007 in output. Finland is the country that's most adversely affected and is way below where it was. It is the manufacturing economies, of course, the economies that have done best are the resource economies, like Canada, that have suffered. And that's the second aspect of this. But the third aspect of this actually also explains in much simpler terms what's going on in Europe. And I think that there's something that actually contradicts what Richard said about fund managers in Spain and so on. The manufacturing countries of the world cannot support their manufacturing sectors on domestic demand. They have to export. Now, you see that in Japan even through the crisis. Japanese exports and largely manufacturers rise steadily throughout the crisis. They think of themselves as a resource-poor country. They have to have a positive balance of payments for safety purposes, and they do it by exporting manufacturers. China has done manufacturing and export-led growth. You have Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. They used to run big deficits, but after the crisis of 1997, where they had to borrow in foreign currencies, the currencies collapsed and everybody went bankrupt, they were never going to do that again, and you see large and increasing surpluses. Countries like Germany with powerful manufacturing sectors, both in terms of the unions and the firms, have to save those sectors through imports. But there is one big global problem. When you add up over all countries, the surpluses and the deficits have to be zero. Somebody has to eat those surpluses. And you start to see it in 1997-98 when the Koreas, Indonesias, and Thailands who are running deficits run into trouble. They go from deficit to surplus. The deficits travel to Brazil, Mexico, Russia, and Argentina. In turn, they collapse. Who's the deficit country of last resort? It's the United States, because it borrows in its own currency. But there's a huge problem for the United States, and you see this in the crisis. Once you're running a chronic deficit of 6 to 7% of GDP to accommodate the rest of the world's surpluses, you have a huge problem sustaining full employment. And the way we did it was with a housing bubble and with a zero savings rate, which means that since the top 20% of households with 40% of the income save about 6% of GDP, the bottom 60% of households were just saving 6% and were spending 110% of their income, which is not sustainable. When that stopped in the United States as a result of the end of the housing bubble, the ability of the world to absorb these export surpluses went away. And I think we will have a continuing problem of trying to grow until countries make the transition consciously, and they're busy resisting it as hard as they can, out of this dying manufacturing sector. The analogy to the Depression, of course, is that in the Depression, what died was agriculture. And that sector brought down the industrial sector with it as agricultural incomes collapsed, and people weren't prepared to abandon it. Turns out that we got very lucky in the Depression, because what World War II did, certainly in the United States, is that not only did it provide Keynesian stimulus, but it was fabulous industrial policy. It got everybody off the farms and into the cities and the war factories or through the army, which was a transition they couldn't have afforded at that level of agricultural income to finance for themselves. So you've got this huge structural global problem, and no evidence that anybody's working on solving it. And it certainly accounts for the lack of investment, because you have this chronic deflationary pressure in the global economy as everybody tries to export. It also, by the way, accounts for the financial problems. Because one of the things in the United States that happens to the United States is when we run a deficit, the rest of the world has to eat the dollars. If the Chinese want to get rid of their dollars, they can either run a deficit on current account, which isn't going to happen in your lifetime, or they can reinvest them in the United States. When they reinvest them in the United States, of course, they drive interest rates down, and as outside, relatively stupid investors, they create an opportunity to do what Wall Street does best, which it did to the Japanese in the late 1980s, which is skin outside investors. But that seems to have been driven by the flip side of the deficits. Now, in Europe, you can see what's going on. You essentially, within the euro area, have a gold standard. Germany, which is the most competitive country that under normal circumstances would have its surplus limited by the rise of the mark, now doesn't have to worry about that. It means that the German surplus is stable and growing, and the other countries have to eat that surplus. As they eat that surplus and run deficits on current account, they have to import money on capital account. It's not that the Spanish managers are investing overseas, because we know on balance, Spain is running a capital account deficit. Italy is running a capital account deficit. It means that in order to sustain those economies at full employment, because the government deficit is not self-financing, you have to depend on the kindness of strangers. It's not the Spanish fund managers who you have to worry about, it's the German, Dutch, and other surplus country fund managers who have to recycle the money. And if we learned one lesson, I think, in the whole history of these kinds of crises is, do you all know who Blanche Dubois is? She's a character in Streetcar Named Desire, whose philosophy of life is, I have always depended on the kindness of strangers. If you depend on outsiders for financing in these circumstances, if you depend on the kindness of strangers, you'll have to forgive me for saying this, what's going to happen to you is what happened to Blanche Dubois. She gets raped in the end. It's not a good economic philosophy. So you've got this fundamental financing problem allied to this chronic deflationary pressure, and it really is all a unified process. It's not that those parrots in those companies suddenly entered shock. Now I want to say one last thing, because the zero interest rate has come up. First of all, the zero interest rate is relatively late in the cycle. It still doesn't apply to long-term corporate bonds. It has been more or less true nearly in Japan, but again, not quite for corporate bonds. But all the empirical evidence we have is that interest rates within the range of variation we see do not affect investment. Investment is driven by perceptions of risk and accelerators in demand that drive the demand for investment. So it's not a surprise, I think, that the zero interest rates have not simulated investment, because nobody has ever been able to find a significant interest rate effect on investment.
Very good. Let me start with a question for you both, which is, the world seems focused on the role of financial intermediaries, and a lot of the money and energy and reform has been directed towards essentially recapitalizing and refinancing the banks.
Right.
As I listen to you, Richard, I hear that the banks may be repaired, but it's the borrowers who don't want their money. So the fact that they're repaired is not sufficient to propel the economy forward. In Bruce, in your perspective, the fact that the banks are impaired or fined or what have you really doesn't matter, because the real economy is gripped by a deflation, and the dearth of investment demand and the dearth of aggregate demand has very little to do with the credit allocation process. So I'm asking each of you, have we misplaced our focus in Western remedies in the last few years?
Well, whenever a huge bubble bursts, you have two problems. The borrowers at the problems at the lenders, and the problem at the borrowers. The problem at the lenders, we call it financial crisis. And the financial crisis can be handled quite quickly. I used to handle that at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, handling the Latin American debt crisis. I was in the middle of that crisis. I had to do all the dirty work that all this came from Paul Volcker. I had to do it. So I know what can be done, and if it's done correctly, you can handle it in a relatively short period of time. capital injection, liquidity injection, ring fencing the problem with the banks, and do whatever that's necessary to get these things moving. That can be done within 1 or 2 years. But then if it's a problem with the borrowers, the large part of the borrowers having balance sheet problems, then this is going to take a long time because there's so little that the central bank can do to encourage borrowers to borrow. And this part I differ with Bruce because in all the other previous post-war recessions, lowering of interest rates, fiscal stimulus, I think did produce some results. And the models that were in the econometric profession did produce halfway decent, I mean, never perfect, but halfway decent forecast of where the economy is going. But this time around, those models are all missing the direction. And I think it's different because too large of a population is having balance sheet problems at the borrowers level. And when the government cannot come out and tell the public, please don't repair your balance sheets, it's okay, don't repair it. It's not going to work. The private sector has no choice, it has to repair its balance sheets. And if the monetary policy is also not working, then the government has to act. But that's very difficult in a democracy to explain average people that if someone is saving money, someone else has to borrow and spend. And most people will say, I have to balance my book, he has to balance his, the companies have to balance, how come the government doesn't have to balance? And this kind of very simple response makes continuation of fiscal stimulus very difficult and end up lengthening this recession, what I call balance sheet recession, much longer than necessary, especially in a democracy during peacetime.
Bruce?
Yeah, let me talk first about the role of the banks, and then let me talk a little bit about fiscal stimulus, but let me do it in the opposite order. It seems to me when you look at the US data, which is that government spending at the federal level has gone from 20 to 25% of GDP. It's very hard to say that absence of fiscal stimulus is the problem. The housing overhang is maybe 2% of GDP. Now it is true that the deficit is still 3 to 4% of GDP. We're still bleeding from that one, but there has been massive fiscal stimulus, and it does not seem to have altered things as in the past. As far as the banking system goes, it really is an interesting observation that while interest rates never affected anything, at least nobody could detect an econometric effect, monetary policy was very powerful historically. I could show you, in fact, I had a chart, we were banned from using charts, of what the connection was between nominal changes in the money supply and nominal GDP 1 year later. And in the 1960s is an incredibly tight relationship. By the 1990s, it has disappeared completely. It seems to me you want to think about why is it that monetary policy worked then and doesn't seem to work now? And also, why is it that it works in some countries and doesn't work in others? What we used to have in the United States was a regulated ceiling of 0% interest on demand deposits. That was a tax on depositors and a subsidy to the banking system. In fact, what it meant was, since they never reduced the money supply, deposits were a source of permanent zero interest rate financing to the banking system. And there were other countries, notably Japan, that also did that historically. What that meant was that when the money supply expanded, just ordinary open market operations, and you forced more deposits into people's hands, that was a hidden tax and subsidy system that injected equity directly into the banks. And if what's important is risk absorption capacity, not the price of money, that greatly increased the risk absorption capacity of banks, which meant they would absorb more risk from firms, and the terms on which they lend matter apparently in studies more than the average interest rate at which they learn. That tax and subsidy system went away when they abolished the limit on interest on demand deposits. So this hidden TARP disappeared, and it disappeared all over the world. And what you start to see, of course, is To enable banking systems to recover, you have to do direct subsidies to replace that tax and subsidy system. So that Sweden, which is the big success story in the late 1980s and recovering from this kind of a serious crisis, directly recapitalizes the banks. In the Asia crisis, which is at least as bad as this, there was at least as much over leverage. Korea and Malaysia that directly recapitalized the banks recover really quickly. That Indonesia and Thailand that try and rely on traditional monetary policy, like Japan did in the crisis, don't see any effect. So I think that one of the things that we have also inadvertently done that is actually showing up for the first time, although you do see evidence of it in the slow recovery from a very mild recession in the US in 1991, is we have basically disarmed traditional monetary policy. So poor old Ben Bernanke is having to learn a whole lot of new dance steps in order to try and get this party going. But I think that again is a fundamental structural change that is passed below the radar because nobody's thinking about it.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll move to the group, the audience. I'll start with you, Bruce, but I'll ask you both the same question. Given your diagnosis, what remedy do you prescribe for putting the world economy back into forward motion?
Okay, and I think you have to go back to why the Second World War cures the Depression. One of the things in the session I mentioned is that Paul Samuelson, who was the great Keynesian, thought at the end of the Second World War the US was going back into the Depression. And he went all over Washington telling people this was going to happen. He was so wrong, he never made another economic forecast in his whole life. When you think about what is it that he missed, is he missed the fact that the necessary structural transformation of the economy. By the way, 30 to 35% of the US population was working directly or indirectly in agriculture at the beginning of the Depression, and that population doesn't fall at all during the Depression because the people can't afford to move. The war moves them. It pays for them to go into the war plants and it pays for them to go into the army. The forced savings finances the transition to manufacturing in the cities, although there's a terrible housing shortage, obviously, in the cities after the war. So you got a very successful unconscious industrial policy. I think globally, in the countries that are trying to save their manufacturing sectors as sources of employment, which they're going to fail to do, by the way. It's going to be plenty of manufacturing, but it's going to be like agriculture. There aren't going to be a lot of manufacturing jobs. Germany, China, Japan have got to start to build big, powerful, effective service sectors. And it's in medical care, and it's in education, and it's in all sorts of other, hopefully, non-financial services. And that's going to take focused government intervention, not just building bridges to nowhere.
So you're wanting to be a catalyst to sectoral reallocation?
Yes, I think you want to have a vision that you've got people on a global basis trapped in manufacturing jobs that are going away. They can't do the migration across borders, so these exchange rate manipulations are trying to do it and are causing this chronic deflationary pressure. And you've got to go to the places where those people can move and generate those jobs, and that requires institution building. That requires financing, and given imperfect information in financial markets, that's going to require government support.
And it requires overcoming the threshold effects.
Yes, the threshold effects of those things, yeah. Exactly.
Okay. Richard, how do we escape from this?
I and Bruce are describing the same phenomena from a slightly different perspective. He has great emphasis on agriculture, I just noticed.
That's in the Depression.
Yes,
that's
of course, in the Depression.
Ago.
But that's
Not today.
a huge amount of orders that the government gave to make fighter planes, battleships, tanks to fight the Germans and the Japanese. That was the key that got everything moving. If you're in a company with a balance sheet underwater, but suddenly you have this huge order from the government that they need to build P-51 fighter planes, 10,000 of them in just 2 years. Wow, then everything starts moving. Right? Because then the creditors will say, yeah, I know you have a balance sheet problems, but now you have a huge government order. Maybe I'll lend you money. And then things start moving. And so the role of government spending in this kind of situation, I think, is far bigger than usual. Now, a lot of people argue that, but government fiscal stimulus has a very low multiplier. They are measuring from a wrong base. If the Japanese government did not put in the fiscal stimulus through the last 20 years, Japanese GDP should have fallen at least 30-40% from where they are now, given the asset prices fell 87% nationwide. And the amount of wealth the Japanese lost as a result of falling asset prices was 3 times bigger than the loss that Americans suffered during the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933. 3 times. And the US lost GDP equivalent to 46%, the nominal GDP down 46% from 1929 to 1933. Japan should have lost even more. If you measure the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus from that point to where the Japanese GDP actually was, then you see that the effect of fiscal stimulus was very large. In fact, during this period, if you, based on this hypothetical GDP going to the level before the bubble, without the fiscal stimulus, and the actual GDP over a 15-year period from 1990 to 2005, the difference is over 2,000 trillion yen. And the amount of fiscal deficit that Japan incurred during that period was 460. So basically 460 trillion fiscal stimulus buying GDP equivalent of 2,000 trillion. I thought that was a pretty good deal. But that's the way people have to start thinking, that without the fiscal stimulus, what would have happened? And here I guess I differ with Bruce that I think the fiscal stimulus that President Obama put in was absolutely essential, given what happened to us. And because of that, we were able to hold the GDP from a total collapse, because you know how it was falling right after the Lehman shock. So I would argue that fiscal stimulus is very, very important, especially in Europe today. And the key difference where I differ with Bruce here is the amount of private sector savings in these countries today. At 0 interest rates, US private sector is saving 8.5% of GDP. I wish I could put on the charts. That's amazing. We have never seen anything like this in the post-war period. That private sector, it's companies, banks, and households together saving 8.5%. And you look at across the countries in Europe, Western Europe, you see the same pattern. Before the bubble, they're all, in the flow of funds below 0. That is, say, households are borrowing money, companies borrowing money. Now they're all above 0 in the financial surplus range at the lowest interest rates they have ever seen. So in that kind of world, a very rare type of recession, I think government has to borrow and spend. And the government has to explain to the public why they're doing it. They're doing it because you guys have to repair your balance sheets, and I cannot tell you not to repair your balance sheets. So I have to get the economy going. After your balance sheets are repaired, then we reverse roles. The government will be repairing its balance sheets.
Okay.
Private sector hopefully will
Can you
go
hear me?
back to what it is good at,
Okay.
borrow and spend.
But
But until
can you hear
that
me
is
now?
understood, I think this recession could continue and the situation could get very ugly, especially in Europe.
Yeah,
thought
can I
was-
say 3 things quickly? First, the balance sheets are repaired. Secondly, in the wake of every recession, of course, the private sector goes to huge savings. That is the standard balance sheet recession. We've seen it in every recession in the United States. But 3, the way you want to measure multipliers, and it's at the heart of the difficulty with fiscal policy, is not multipliers on the way up, which is when you apply the stimulus, because there are constraints on capacity. It's multipliers on the way down. When the government spending falls, as it does at the end of the Second World War, and when the government spending declines sharply, as it did in various instances in Japan, the economy did not contract.
What?
And that's a multiplier.
1997? We have
97.
5 quarters of negative growth,
Right.
complete breakdown in
What-
the banking system.
right. What
Budget
per- what
deficit
percent-
actually increased by 68%.
Just a second. What was the decline in GDP?
3%.
Wow! That's a collapse in GDP for a huge reduction in government spending? What was the
there
decline
was-
wait a minute, what was the decline in US GDP at the end of the Second World War when all those contracts for jet planes and so on went away? Nothing.
Because private sector balance sheets are repaired.
Right, but private sector balance sheets are repaired now all over the world, and why is the economy still growing
It's not
slowly?
repaired. It's
In
not
Japan, it's repaired.
Oh, in Japan, yes.
In the United States, it's repaired.
I don't
in
think
Korea,
so.
it's repaired. In Indonesia, it's
Oh,
repaired.
Indonesia, Korea, perhaps.
I
And-
need to
and
let some other
Korea
people in onto this
Are
conversation.
in good shape. The
And,
balance sheet, in the United States, the balance sheet recession is over. Sorry.
Okay. I'm enjoying the sparks. I just want to get some more fire going out there.
There could be some. Look, we've had two narratives today from both the speakers. The one from Richard Koo was, the title of your book was Balance Sheet Recession, but you actually said several times today that the actual problem now is a borrowing problem. A borrowing problem. Bruce's central narrative was the low demand growth in manufacturing relative to productivity. Well, it seems to me the central question to reconcile this is what accounts for that low demand growth in manufacturing relative to productivity worldwide, and would not in fact the remedies suggested by Richard provide that demand growth for manufacturing?
Okay, so I want to be clear about periods. Let's go back to agriculture. What accounted for the low growth in demand in agriculture compared to the high rate of productivity growth? As heavy as Americans have tried to become in eating the agricultural surplus, there is a natural limit to how much agricultural output you can consume. It turns out that when you look at consuming manufacturers, there is just a natural limit to what people spend money on. At the margin, when you look at households, they spend, both as they get richer in cross sections and over time, they spend increasing fractions of their money on services, medical care, education, financial services actually for some reason, and personal services. Unless you're going to order people to buy manufacturers, it seems to me, like trying to order people to eat more food, you're not going to be able to correct that demand problem.
Well, there's a huge difference between manufacturing and agriculture. Whether you grow wheat in the United States or in China or in somewhere in Russia, it's still wheat. But if you're building cars and if you think you have a world-beating technology on hybrid, no matter what saturation of the market is, you think you can still do it. And I think Toyota has proven that everybody thought Japan is overpriced and then they shouldn't be able to compete. Well, Toyota became the largest car company in the world because of the hybrid technology. And the second point is, why is just Toyota and not the other Japanese companies at the time? Toyota had no debt. Toyota was screwed by the bankers 70 years ago, and the family said, never again, never borrow money. So Toyota had no debt in the entire period. Toyota was not affected by balance sheet recession. Toyota was able to use all their cash flow to develop new hybrid technology. But Nissans, Hondas, they all had to use their cash flow to pay down debt, and that's where the difference was made. So in manufacturing, if you think you have a world-beating product, well, they could be still air conditioning or it could be still washing machines, but if you think you have something better, you still go ahead and do it. And I think that's the key difference between agriculture and manufacturing.
No, it's not actually. Because an individual farmer could produce wheat more cheaply and sell a lot more wheat, or he could produce better quality wheat and sell a lot more wheat. But farmers in the aggregate cannot sell a lot more wheat. Toyota as an individual car company can do better than other car companies, but car companies in the aggregate are not going to be able to do that in general. That's the similarity.
But Toyota is still making huge
Does that-
cash flow profits,
what-
so Toyota, how do you prevent Toyota from investing? You can't.
And the question is, Toyota invests, and what happens to the companies that are losing business to Toyota? They invest less because they're shrinking. The critical thing is aggregate activity here. Individual firms in this world are going to do extremely well, and there are actually other interesting developments that have been associated with this change to services. Profitability is held up extraordinarily well, and it's because services tend to be locally produced and consumed, not in globally competitive markets, and they tend to be far more profitable. But you've got to be dealing here with aggregate amounts, not with individual stories.
For government policies, maybe, but for individual companies, they'll still go ahead and
Hold on,
invest.
guys. There are a lot of people in this room. We can talk afterwards. Anybody else have a thought you'd like
Question?
to share? Oh, I'm sorry, Mario.
Oh, sorry. I have actually a comment and a question. A comment on what Bruce was saying, which is that, he's focusing on the manufacturing sector. I completely agree with you that there's a problem, a glut here, you want to call it, in manufacturing side here. We got China trying to, clearly there's a big problem at that level. But I think what we have here is a much bigger problem having to do with aggregate demand in general. It doesn't matter the composition so much right now, I would argue, but there's a big problem here that if we're looking at the way growth in demand in general is taking place. Now, I agree completely that manufacturing or something else should spearhead some of that growth. It's not doing that, but there's nothing else in its place, you could argue. But what has happened here is that there's very little spending in general, and one has to explain that as well. And it seems to me that Richard's story seems to sound a lot more sensible to me when it comes to the issue of how the household sector in particular is deleveraging right now. And it's still doing so, I think, frankly. Now, what I'd like to ask is a question to Richard, though, which actually there's two issues there that I was concerned about. One has to do with the fact that you talk, obviously there's a balance sheet recession, all that, there's deleveraging. However, if you look at it, you seem to sort of focus on all these sectors of the economy. But if you look particularly at the household sector, take the case of Canada that I know very well, clearly the household sector is the one that has been, in a sense, faced the problem of indebtedness and trying to deleverage. On the other hand, and therefore trying to minimize its debt load, if you wish. However, when it comes to the business sector, it's the opposite. It's maximizing its liquidity in a sense. Okay? We have a situation that we haven't seen hitherto, really, for, if you look at past history, where the business sector is the one that is swimming in liquidity and there's no incentive to invest. Now, I could tell you why there's no incentive to invest, but you cannot say that they're facing a problem here of balance sheet here when it comes to the business sector as a whole. Okay? And so, I think one would want to qualify that. The second issue that I wanted to also ask of you is to explain a little bit better, because I don't buy your story about Europe too well. Okay? Now, it is, if you take the situation of Canada, we have provinces that have different debt ratios too, okay? Just like they do in Europe. And indeed, each province here is in a similar situation as the European countries are vis-a-vis the ECB, for instance, in the case of Europe, as vis-a-vis the Bank of Canada. The big difference here is, of course, we have a central government as well. And the issue, therefore, is that the actual mechanisms of work are such that ultimately, if a province faces a really serious crunch, there is a kind of daddy up there that can bail them out too as well. Well, that is not the situation of Europe. And therefore, you got a problem at that level, it seems to me, that it's the fact that ultimately there is no connection between these two, that I think would explain a lot more than just because they're rushing to Germany in buying up, let's say, public, government bonds or whatever. Okay.
Wait a minute, what's the question?
Well, it's a question of trying to, if you could clarify to me the story having to do with the fact that in Europe, okay, your story had to do simply with the fact that there's movement, let's say from Spain to Germany for holders of bonds here. And I'm just saying here that you could have the same situation here, but it won't lead to the same effects at all. Okay, in terms of crisis.
Actually, this is not the first time that there was this crazy flow of funds from government bonds market in Europe. This is the second part of that story, actually. The first part was between 2000 and 2005. At year 2000, a German telecom bubble burst, and it was a huge problem for the German economy. You can see the corporate behavior changing dramatically after year 2000 because they were so heavily into the telecom bubble at that time. And then Germany actually falls into balance sheet recession, with both household sector and corporate sector saving money, deleveraging instead of borrowing money. And because Germany fell into that, economy weakened very much. Remember, Germany was the sick man of Europe between 2000 and 2005. Now, because the economy was doing very poorly and it was a balance sheet recession, they should have used the fiscal stimulus to handle it. But Maastricht Treaty, which the Germans themselves put in, limited them from using the fiscal stimulus. They couldn't use it, although in the end they did go over 3% on a few occasions. They couldn't use it fully. Economy continued to weaken. Then what happened? The ECB, the European Central Bank, in order to save the German economy, brought interest rates down to 2%. Remember that, 2003? And other countries in Europe did not have this crazy IT bubble mentality that the Germans had. So those economies are doing relatively okay. Interest rates are brought down to 2%. All the other economies then end up having a bubble. So the money supply grew, the economy grew, and the German banks, this is kind of got back to Bruce's point, German banks facing all this money coming back to them, and no one's borrowing money in Germany, end up putting the money into Spanish, Portuguese, Irish, those government bond market, kept the rates lower than usual. The bubble will get worse and worse and worse. And at that time, Germany, because there was no loan demand in Germany, because everybody was paying down debt, no one was borrowing money, money supply grew very, very slowly. The rest of Europe grew very quickly. German money supply grew very slowly. German wages, German prices also grew very slowly as a result. Then, 5-10 years later, Germany is very competitive relative to the rest of Europe, because the rest of Europe inflated. The Germans could not inflate because there was no loan demand within Germany. And then the Germans were then able to export its product to the peripherals. So when you look at the German trade surplus during that period, it did not grow very much toward North America. It continued to run deficit against Asia. But then against the rest of Eurozone, it skyrocketed to become the largest trade surplus country in the world. Germany was actually running a trade deficit, current account deficit in year 2000, but became one of the largest surplus countries in the world just 7 years later because of this mechanism. So I tell the German people, every time I see them, and now they're finally beginning to listen to my side of the story, that they should be more humble toward the peripheral countries, because they are the ones, in some sense, were sacrificed to get the German economy out of the mess. And in 2006, I actually confronted one of the high officials at the European Central Bank that this is not fair to the rest of the European countries. You're making a bubble out of the rest to save the German economy. And at that time, this ECB official said to me, straight face, this is what single currency means. And now we have the opposite situation, right? German economy is doing very well now, thanks to all the competitiveness gains, and unemployment rate, the lowest rate in 20 years, industrial production back to the previous peak, but the rest of the Europe is doing very poorly. Rates are lowered to 0.75, which is too low for the Germans, and not doing much for the rest because the rest are in balance sheet recession. And so something has to be done about this whole European mechanism. It's not just happened after the collapse of the housing bubble. It has a much longer story behind it. And I don't know about the Canadian provinces, but suppose you are the resident of the province. Do you get some special treatment purchasing province bonds, or not at all? Not at all.
No, it's like the U.S. states.
But you in U.S.
The U.S. states, the state of New York, the state of Massachusetts,
some of the
has to sell its bonds on its own.
If
you get a tax deduction, but you've got to pay the bonds yourself.
If you
they don't have
buying
that
principal
in
bonds.
Canada,
Nothing.
right?
All right, well, I better tie things up, but I have to say, in watching this session, it reminded me of the movie Jerry Maguire. There's a scene where the sports agent, Jerry Maguire, played by Tom Cruise, is standing in a locker room, and he gets very, very heated. And the athlete he represents, Cuba Gooding, looks at him and he starts to smile. And he says, "You think we're fighting. You think we're mad at each other. I think we're just starting to communicate." And I will say that INET stands for this type of vibrant communication, and I want to thank both of our speakers for engaging today and giving us a lot to think about as we explore our own research in the future. Thank you.
As possible before everybody notices, and then once your balance sheets are repaired, of course you come out and says, of course my balance sheet is very clean. But in the meantime, you keep your heads low, make sure not too many people pay attention to you, and you quietly pay down debt. And when a large part of the society is doing that all at the same time, you know, in the national economy, someone is saving money or paying down debt, you better have someone on the other side borrowing and spending money. And in the usual world, we have the financial sector in between taking the money from the savers and giving to the lenders, giving to the people who can use it. And if there are too many borrowers, interest rates are raised. Too few borrowers, interest rates are lowered. Make sure that this circle is completed. But when the traditional borrowers, the potential borrowers, they have balance sheet problems, they don't borrow money even at zero interest rates, then the whole thing breaks down. All the saved funds, deleveraged funds come into the financial sector. It cannot go out because there are no borrowers. And that becomes the leakage to the income stream, and the economy starts shrinking. And in this world, we are really lost because we were never trained to think about what to do when the private sector is minimizing debt. And Japan struggled that from around 1995 onwards, where demand for funds from corporate sector goes into the negative range, even at zero interest rates. And a lot of things are tried, monetary stimulus, quantitative easing, all of that. I would argue that at the end, and if you think it through logically, the only thing that works under circumstance like this is government to borrow the excess savings, so-called unborrowed savings in the private sector, and spend it.
Long and deep recession. And in the conversation today, Richard Koo, with his well-known vision of a balance sheet recession, and Bruce, along with a team, has written very significant, I've read two of the papers about the relationship of real shocks to productivity and how the real structural problems really are at the core of, how would I say, what becomes a long and durable recession and has financial manifestations, but he sees the root cause emanating from a different place. So what I thought we'd do is we'd start with Richard and then Bruce, each talking for 10 to 12 minutes about their vision, their synopsis, and then we'll open the conversation between us, and then we'll move to conversation with the audience following that. So Richard, why don't you take away?
Okay. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about This Time is Different. Since we're going to start with Rogoff's book with the title This Time is Different, I believe that this time is different. And when we look around the indicators, we have zero interest rates in the United States for 4 years now. And we don't have full employment, we don't have inflation, we don't have much increase in money supply growth, we don't have much increase in credit growth either. And it's not just in the United States, it's all around the Western world, together with Japan. And you look at the budget deficit to GDP, it's 7 to 10% in all these countries. But where are the government bond yields? In Japan, less than 1%, in the US, 1 to 2.
Again, thank you to CG for hosting this event and I would say continuing to build the momentum of INET and new economic thinking. This afternoon I have with me two extraordinary thinkers. The chief economist from the Nomura Research Institute, Richard Koo, who's no stranger to INET, having appeared in the first session of our first conference, where he and Ken Rogoff discussed the unfolding crisis. And to his left, Bruce Greenwald, a professor of economics and finance at Columbia Business School, who is, how do I say, from my experience, going back to being a graduate student at Princeton in the early 80s,
oh my God,
he is the secret Joe Stiglitz, having been a co-author of some of the most powerful and profound papers that Joe has written in his career, and I consider Bruce a co-author of a Nobel Prize, and Joe agrees with me, by the way. He says that very clearly. So, at any rate, we're here to talk today about the Great Recession, and going back to the Reinhardt and Rogoff presentation, they describe that in the presence of large amounts of debt, that the ensuing adjustment, the recession, is quite deep and quite prolonged. But in that work, they do not provide a perspective or a theory of why this is a long.
Even in the UK, 1 to 2% range. And all these astronomical quantitative easings still haven't produced any of the effect that a lot of people expected. And those, in my view, suggest that this time is different. And what is different this time compared to other times, then we have to look into all sorts of indicators. There's so much confusion out there as to why this is so different from what we had earlier. Some people say there should be more fiscal stimulus, others say less, more monetary, others will say less, more structural reform, others will say no time to do structural reform when there's so much unemployment. Then people will argue that banking problem is the question, but some people will say if you go too fast on the disposal of non-performing loans, situation could actually get worse. So all these debates are going on in this part of the world. Very little consensus on what is the right thing to do. But it just so happened that Japan went through all of this 15 years ago. And I happened to be associated with the whole event because in 1997, Japan was told by the IMF, OECD, all these people who know nothing about anything, told Japan that you're building bridges to nowhere, roads to nowhere, economy going nowhere, and then you have aging population, why don't you cut the deficit? I was the only person in Japan who said, no, if you cut now, the whole thing will come crashing down. Well, it came crashing down. 5 quarters of negative growth, complete breakdown in the banking system, and it took Japan 10 years to climb out of that one policy mistake. And what I learned from that experience is that this is different in the sense that private sectors in all these economies, Japan first 15 years ago, and then now in the US, UK, Spain, Ireland, Portugal, all these economies, private sector is no longer maximizing profits. They're actually minimizing debt. And all the neoclassical economics we learn in schools are based on private sector maximizing profits. And of course, there's elaborate theories built on it. But when that fundamental assumption is violated, then we really have to start from scratch. And why are the private sectors sorts minimizing debt? Well, during the bubble days, they borrowed all this money and invested in all sorts of assets. And asset prices collapsed, liabilities remain, and suddenly they realized that their balance sheet's underwater. The balance sheet's underwater means you're bankrupt, you have to climb out of this thing. And even though people pay a lot of attention to those people who did go bankrupt, there are 10 times, 100 times more people who are trying to avoid that fate by trying to pay down their debt as quickly as possible so that you come out of this thing without not too many people noticing. But it's this debt repayment, repairing balance sheets by the people who do have cash flow. Whether you have still employed, you have an income to pay your mortgages, or you still have cash flow, you're running a company. It's these people paying down debt that causes what I call balance sheet recession. So what is balance sheet recession? I define it as private sector minimizing debt at near zero interest rates. Because if people are paying down debt at high interest rates, you can always think that you can bring rates down and then they will change their behavior. But if people are still paying down debt at near zero interest rates, then you're stuck because you cannot bring interest rates any lower. But if you are bankrupt, you really you don't have much choice. You have to pay down debt quietly.